At 4:47 p.m. local time, a Russian Su-34 fullback lifted off from Saki Air Base in Crimea on what its crew believed would be a routine strike mission. The pilot and weapons systems officer had done this dozens of times. The whole sortie would take less than 40 minutes. They'd be back in time for dinner. What they didn't know was that they'd been tracked from the moment their wheels left the runway. 18 kilometers inside Ukrainian territory, hidden in a tree line with its radar cold, a Ukrainian Patriot battery had been waiting for exactly this moment. The Russian crew climbed through 15,000 feet on a heading of 330 degrees, engines humming at cruise power. The pilot monitored the threat warning receiver. Nothing but the usual background noise of Ukrainian search radars sweeping the sky. No locks, no spikes. The electronic warfare suite showed green across the board. The Khibiny-U pods you see here on each wingtip were primed and ready, but so far there was nothing to jam. At 18,000 feet, the Wizzo began configuring the UMPK release parameters. 62 kilometers to the launch basket, 11 minutes to weapons away. He'd already selected the target coordinates, a grid square in central Kherson that Russian intelligence had flagged as a Ukrainian command node. Whether it actually was a military target or just another residential block, the Wizzo would never know. His job was to put the bombs on the coordinates. What happened after that wasn't his problem. The pilot leveled off at 24,000 feet and throttled back to conserve fuel. Airspeed settled at 870 kilometers per hour. The aircraft was running emission silent. No radar, no data link chatter, just a cold airframe on a straight line heading. Standard procedure for penetrating Ukrainian airspace. The less you broadcast, the harder you are to track. Or so they thought. What the Su-34 crew couldn't know was their cold airframe still radiated heat. And Ukrainian passive sensors had been watching that thermal signature since it had crossed the coastline. The pilot believed he was invisible. In reality, he was a flashlight in a dark room. 18 kilometers inside Ukrainian territory, the Patriot battery commander stared at his display and allowed himself a single thought. This is the one. 21 minutes of passive tracking. An Su-34 flying fat and happy on a predictable heading, emission silent, completely unaware it had been watched since the crossing of the Crimean coastline. The geometry was perfect. The timing was perfect. In 15 years of air defense work, opportunities like this came maybe once or twice in a career, if you were lucky. But the commander had been doing this long enough to know that luck cuts both ways. That Su-34 wasn't some rookie crew flying their first combat sortie. The moment his radar lit up, those two Russians would do everything in their power to survive. And Russians don't eject over Ukrainian territory if they can help it. They'd fight until the airframe came apart from around them. His battery was set up in a tree line, radar cold, locked into the only firing position with the geometry to intercept. The bomber was a gift, but gifts in war always come with a price. The question was whether he'd live long enough to pay it. The passive track was the problem. Ukrainian sensors could detect the bomber without transmitting anything, but this aircraft was running emission silent. No radar, no data link chatter, just a cold airframe on a straight line heading. The passive network was estimating the bomber's position from thermal contrast alone, and the margin of error was ugly, bearing 210 degrees plus or minus 4. At 90 kilometers, that's a 12-kilometer wide band of sky. Trying to guide a missile into a 12-kilometer question mark is like throwing at a dartboard you can barely see. The battery commander needed to shrink that cone, and the only way to do it was to turn on his radar. A C-band phased array system powerful enough to track a fighter-sized target at 150 kilometers. The problem is that kind of power doesn't whisper, it screams. He ordered the first emission, 3 seconds. The radar lit, swept, and caught the bomber at 88 kilometers, climbing through 18,000 feet. The uncertainty cone collapsed from 12 kilometers to under 2. Better. But the system needed range rate data, how fast the target is closing, and 3 seconds wasn't enough to calculate that. Still no firing solution. The radar went dark. They'd have to broadcast longer next time. 3 seconds was enough for the Russian Orlan 10 drone circling 800 meters overhead, essentially a flying wire trap carrying cameras and signals intelligence payload tuned to catch exactly this kind of transmission. C-band, phased array. That fingerprint is unmistakable. The Orlan's operator relayed the contact to Russian fire coordination. The 3-second burst wasn't long enough for a precision fix, but it narrowed the search area to a few hundred meters, good enough for what came next. The first FPV drone signal appeared within a minute, vectoring toward the tree line at 110 kilometers per hour. FPV kamikaze drones are cheap, disposable, and fly low enough to weave through the trees. Basically a flying grenade with a camera strapped to it. A Ukrainian Bukovel-AD electronic warfare truck parked 400 meters east caught the incoming signal and activated a directional jamming cone, flooding the frequency with so much noise that the operator's video feed shredded into static. His drone pitched into a plowed field. But jamming isn't subtle. A directional jammer is like shining a spotlight in a dark room. It tells everyone where you're standing. Russian EW analysts now had a data point. Something in that tree line was worth protecting with a dedicated jammer. That's the kind of conclusion that gets more drones heading your way. A second FPV appeared 40 seconds later, jammed. A third probed on 2.4 GHz instead of the usual 5.8, frequency hopping, testing the Bukovel's limits. The operator was cycling between 3 threat axes now, and each jam was another broadcast. The Russians were mapping a defensive bubble one down drone at a time. The Bukovel couldn't keep this up alone. A Ukrainian FPV drone team operating from a ruined basement 600 meters behind the battery started going after the source, using the direction of each jam signal to estimate operator positions. They found a Russian cell behind a concrete wall, goggles on, antennas up. The Ukrainian drone dove. That cell stopped transmitting, but another took its place almost immediately. The probes were accelerating. The battery commander checked the passive track, Su-34 at 20,000 feet. 8 minutes from the engagement window, still no firing solution. He ordered a second burst, 4 seconds this time. The return was clean. Bomber at 22,000 feet, range 81 kilometers, closing at 14.5 kilometers per minute. Track quality jumped, but the engagement control station still flagged it degraded. One more burst would do it. But the radar had now been active twice from the same position, and this time the Orlan caught something new. The pulse repetition interval, essentially the radar's heartbeat. Every radar has a unique one, like a fingerprint. The Orlan matched it instantly. Not just a radar. Confirmed Patriot, the single highest value target Ukraine owns. Everyone wants credit for a Patriot. The FPV volume spiked. 5, 6 drones probing from different angles on different frequencies. The Bukovel's internal temperature was climbing. The system isn't designed to run like a microwave on full power for 20 minutes straight. The Ukrainian FPV team found a second Russian position 300 meters south, but the probes kept coming. Then one slipped through. Right through the arc, the Bukovel operator uncovered while handling another signal. The Ukrainian team spotted it on cameras, a small black shape weaving through canopy at knee height, heading for the nearest launcher. Their drone intercepted it 80 meters out, both detonated in the underbrush, close enough to rattle the teeth of the crew standing next to the launcher. Then the ground shook. The BM-21 Grad, a truck-mounted rocket launcher carrying 40 tubes that can empty its entire load in under 10 seconds, had fired everything. 40 rockets arced toward the general area of the 2 radar emissions, but 2 short bursts had given Russian targeting a spread, not a point. The rockets landed in a ragged pattern, 1,000 meters north, close enough to shake every vehicle, not close enough to hit. A Ukrainian firefighter counter-battery radar tracked the launch, computed the origin by tracing trajectories backward, and passed the coordinates to a Ukrainian M777 howitzer battery. 6 Excalibur GPS-guided rounds with 2-meter accuracy went downrange. The Grad displaced, but it would take minutes to set up again. The battery commander checked his display. Bomber at 24,000 feet, approaching engagement window. One more emission and he'd have a firing solution, but this time the radar couldn't flash and go dark. The GEM-T interceptors need continuous radar illumination to steer. Think of it like a flashlight guiding a moth, except the moth is traveling at Mach 5 and the flashlight is telling everyone in the room where you're standing. The Orlan, the FPV operators, the next Grad battery, they'd all have a fixed, uninterrupted signal to aim at. At 5:19 p.m., the bomber crossed into the engagement window, committed deep enough that any evasive turn would wreck its release geometry, 90 seconds from the basket. At 5:21 p.m., the Patriot's radar went active. This time, it wasn't going dark. The beam acquired the bomber at 73 kilometers and locked in under 4 seconds. The first PAC-2 GEM-T, 900 kilograms accelerating to Mach 5, roared off the rail, and every Russian sensor in theater now had a continuous Patriot emission to home in on. In the Su-34's cockpit, the radar warning receiver lit up like a disco ball. Fire control lock. The pilot didn't need to check the threat library. That tone meant a missile was either in the air or about to be. He threw the aircraft into a hard defensive brake, rolling nearly inverted and pulling into a descending turn that pinned both crew members into their seats at 6 Gs. The weapons systems officer activated the Khibiny-U electronic countermeasure pods mounted on each wingtip. The system analyzes the incoming radar signal and transmits back a corrupted copy, injecting false range data and ghost targets to confuse the tracking solution. Think of it as answering a phone call with a recording designed to convince the caller they've reached the wrong number. Simultaneously, UV-26 dispensers fired chaff, thousands of metallic strips sized to match the Patriot's radar frequency, blooming into a cloud 300 meters across that looks to the radar exactly like a second aircraft. On the ground, the battery was already tearing itself apart. The moment that GEM-T cleared the rail, the commander ordered displacement. 2 soldiers sprinted to launcher stations and started ripping data cables. One empty launcher was being hooked to a tow vehicle. The Bukovel shifted to omnidirectional jamming, wider, less focused, but the battery was about to be moving. The radar had to stay on. Cut the beam and the missile loses its steering commands, turning a guided interceptor into a very expensive bottle rocket. So the radar kept broadcasting while everyone around it prepared to run. 30 seconds to impact. The bomber pulled hard through its descending turn, losing altitude and speed. The Khibiny cycled through jamming frequencies, but the Patriot's radar was adapting in real time, hopping frequencies, reshaping its waveforms, filtering out every trick the Khibiny tried. 20 seconds. Chaff punching out in bursts, each cloud blooming and falling behind as the bomber maneuvered through it. 15. 10. 5. The GEM-T detonated roughly 60 meters from the airframe, its proximity fuse triggering a wall of preformed tungsten fragments. At that distance, the fragments had spread too thin. The bomber shuddered. Warning lights cascaded across the Wizzo's panel, but flight controls responded. Still flyable. Altitude from 24,000 to 21,000 feet. Speed from 870 to 800 kilometers per hour. Both Fab 1500s still on the pylons. The Wizzo checked the countermeasure inventory. 32 of 128 expendables gone. Chaff and flares burned through in a single defensive sequence. 3 more engagements like that, and they'd be flying with nothing but airframe and prayer. The pilot faced a choice that had to be made in seconds: abort the mission and run for Crimea, or press toward the release basket and drop those bombs on Kherson as briefed. He pressed on. The throttles went forward. On the ground, the Bukovel was cycling through FPV signals faster than at any point in the engagement. The volume had doubled since the radar went continuous, every Russian operator in range converging on the signal. The battery commander barely registered it. He was watching the track data. He authorized a second shot. The radar had been active for over 40 seconds. Russian fire coordination was certainly processing the emission for another Grad salvo. Every additional GEM-T meant 15 more seconds of required radar time, 15 more seconds broadcasting his exact position to everyone who wanted him gone. But the bomber was still flying, still carrying those Fab 1500s. And if it recovered its release geometry, an apartment building in Kherson was going to have a very bad evening. He fired. The second GEM-T arrived at a bomber now at 18,000 feet with a quarter of its countermeasures already spent. And the Patriot was getting smarter. Every evasive turn fed the system more data about how this aircraft behaves, what the Khibiny does at each frequency, where the pilot brakes. The system doesn't just track, it learns. More chaff. Another crushing high G brake. The second missile detonated close enough to pepper the right side of the fuselage with tungsten fragments. A hydraulic warning flashed on the Wizzo's display. The right engine temperature gauge was climbing into the amber. The aircraft was degrading, but still responding to inputs. The radar had been transmitting for over 60 seconds now, somewhere behind the Russian front line. The Grad battery that had relocated after the Excalibur strike was almost certainly back in action, with 60 seconds of continuous C-band emission to aim at. The Patriot crew had no way of knowing whether Russian rockets were already on their way. You don't get a warning. The bomber crew had survived 2 Patriot interceptors now. The pilot was clawing back airspeed. Trying to recover the release geometry, the basket was technically still reachable. The battery commander stared at his display. 2 misses, 5 GEM-Ts remaining. The bomber was damaged, but still flying toward a city full of people. If he fired 3 more interceptors, that was 15 additional seconds of radar time. 15 more seconds for Russian rockets to arrive. If he fired and missed, he'd have burned through 8 interceptors, each one worth about $3 million, on a single engagement with nothing to show for it except an empty magazine and a target that knows exactly where he is. If he didn't fire and the bomber released 3,000 kilograms of high explosive would glide 70 kilometers on GPS guidance into a neighborhood where people were eating dinner. He fired everything he had left. 3 GEM-Ts launched in rapid succession. 1 missile is 1 geometry problem. 2 can sometimes be beaten on similar vectors. 3 launched seconds apart come from 3 different slices of airspace, each closing from a different angle. Turn to defeat the first, and you fly into the second. Dive to avoid the second, and the third has a clean shot against a 14.7-meter wingspan that's now moving 200 kilometers per hour slower than when this engagement started. The bomber tried another brake turn as the last chaff cartridges fired from nearly empty dispensers. But the Patriot's radar had 90 seconds of continuous data on exactly how this jammer operates. Every frequency it hops to, every pattern it repeats. The radar wasn't guessing anymore. The moment the third missile cleared the rail, the radar operator switched to passive. Done transmitting. The GEM-Ts had enough reflected energy to ride home on. Cables ripped out. The mast started collapsing. The antenna array folding hydraulically while 2 soldiers guided the sections. The Bukovel was still jamming FPV drones that were vectoring on an emission that no longer existed. Every vehicle that could move was moving. 73 kilometers away and 14,000 feet up, the bomber was out of answers. Airspeed below 680, countermeasures dry. The first of the 3 detonated within 15 meters of the left wing. Tungsten fragments shredded control surfaces, severed hydraulic lines, and punched through the engine housing. The second detonated below the fuselage moments later. Flight control vanished. The bomber rolled uncontrollably as systems failed faster than the crew could process. The third never needed to arrive. The bomber came apart over the Black Sea. Neither Fab 1500 released. The strike on Kherson never happened. On the ground, the radar operator caught the target track dissolve on his passive display as the mast finished collapsing. He didn't watch. He was already in the cab, engine running, pulling into the access road. The battery scattered down 3 different routes. Headlights off, intervals staggered. The Bukovel was still jamming as it rolled alongside the radar vehicle. Counter battery was suppressing Russian positions as the convoy dispersed, as Russian rockets plowed into an empty field. If you enjoyed this video, then we think you'll love this one on screen. Bye for now.